This is our last week on Nietzsche. We're going to look at the social phenomenon that Nietzsche calls the death of God, and we're going to look in a little more detail at what Nietzsche puts forward as his alternative to slave morality. Remember, I said before that Nietzsche doesn't want us to reject slave morality and revert to master morality. Instead, Nietzsche has his own alternative to slave morality. The first passage, where Nietzsche offers his account of the death of God, is in The Gay Science. It's on page 224. Nietzsche writes, "Have you not heard of the madman who lit a lantern in the bright morning hours, ran to the marketplace, and cried incessantly, 'I seek God, I seek God'? As many of those who did not believe in God were standing around just then, he provoked much laughter. The madman jumped into their midst and pierced them with his eyes. 'Whither is God?' he cried. 'I will tell you. We have killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers. God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him.'" Now, Nietzsche continues this passage by writing, "Here the madman fell silent and looked again at his listeners. They too were silent and stared at him in astonishment. At last he threw his lantern on the ground, and it broke into pieces and went out. 'I've come too early,' he said then. 'My time is not yet. This tremendous event is still on its way. This deed is still more distant from them than the most distant stars, and yet they've done it themselves.'" All right, so there's two questions I want us to reflect on. First, what does it mean when Nietzsche writes, "God is dead"? And second, in what sense do the murderers of God not yet recognize that they have killed God, or that God is dead? I think we can get a bit more illumination on these questions by looking at another passage in which Nietzsche describes the death of God phenomenon. This is later in The Gay Science, on pages 362 and 3. Here Nietzsche writes, "The greatest recent event, that God is dead, that the belief in the Christian God has become unbelievable, is already beginning to cast its first shadows over Europe." Nietzsche continues, "But in the main, one may say, the event itself is far too great, too distant, too remote from the multitude's capacity for comprehension. Much less may one suppose that many people know as yet what this really even means." So the first thing to notice about this passage is that Nietzsche seems to tell us explicitly what it means for God to be dead. It means that people have stopped believing in the Christian God. This is meant to be a sociological observation of Nietzsche's. Nietzsche thinks that there was once a time when the vast majority of people were Christians, believed in the Christian God, and subscribed to Christian morality. And Nietzsche thinks that now, more people than before, and more people than not, are no longer religious, are no longer Christian in particular. The majority of people are atheists. The second thing to notice is that in this passage, just as in the previous, Nietzsche suggests that the majority of people do not yet understand what it means for God to be dead. So what does this mean? To what extent can people not believe in God, but not yet understand what it means to not believe in God? Well, one thing that it might mean is that while the majority of us don't believe in the Christian God, we still subscribe to Christian morality. But I think Nietzsche has more in mind than just this. So on the next page of The Gay Science, Nietzsche writes, under the title, "How We Too Are Still Pious," we see that science also rests on a faith. There simply is no science without presuppositions. The question whether truth is needed must not only have been affirmed in advance, but affirmed to such a degree that the principle, the faith, the conviction finds expression. Nothing is needed more than truth, and in relation to it, everything else has only second-rate value. So Nietzsche's claim here is that while the majority of people have rejected the belief in a single absolute God, they haven't given up on the idea of something that holds absolute value. They've simply replaced the idea of God with the idea of truth. Right, so Nietzsche suggests that insofar as we think science has replaced religion, what we've done is just trade one unconditional value for another. Because the suggestion is that someone who adopts a scientific attitude still holds truth to be something that has unconditional value. Nietzsche elaborates this criticism of truth as having unconditional value at the beginning of Beyond Good and Evil, and again toward the end of the Genealogy of Morals. So at the beginning of Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche asks us why it is that we prefer truth to untruth. He puts the question in these terms. Does believing more truths make our lives better? Or alternatively, are there cases in which it's good for us to believe untruths? Now, Nietzsche's not suggesting that we should believe falsehoods on the whole, instead of believing truths. What he wants us to do is to reject the idea that truth has an unconditional value. Nietzsche thinks that, to the extent that it's good for us to believe truths, or in contexts in which it's good for us to believe truths, we should be able to articulate why it's good for us to believe truths in those contexts. So, for example, in certain contexts, believing truths might make it more likely for us to survive. In other contexts, believing truths might make it more likely for us to be happy. So in such contexts, truth would surely have value, but it wouldn't be an unconditional value. The value of truth would be conditional on its conduciveness to our living well or being happy. But is this to suggest that I can just believe whatever I want, insofar as it makes me happy? Nietzsche rejects this idea later in Beyond Good and Evil. On page 341, Nietzsche writes that every moral code opposes laissez-aller, or anything goes. Nietzsche writes, everything on earth that exists, or has existed by way of freedom, subtlety, daring, dance, and perfect sureness, whether it be in ideas or in governance or in oratory and rhetoric, in the arts as well as in manners, has developed only by virtue of the tyranny of despotic laws. And seriously, it is very likely that this is what is nature and natural, and not the anything goes. Nietzsche continues, every artist knows how far from the feeling of anything goes his most natural condition is. The free ordering, arranging, deciding, shaping that occurs in his moments of inspiration, and how delicately and strictly, especially at such moments, he obeys the thousandfold laws whose very exactness and rigor make a mockery of all conceptual formulations. So here, Nietzsche is strongly opposing the idea that in beliefs or in morals, anything goes, that we can believe or do whatever it is that makes us feel good. He's suggesting, instead, that we ought to live by moral codes, precisely because, in all great areas of human achievement, it's only through discipline and rigor that we produce excellence. And Nietzsche elaborates this critique of science and his account of the alternative to science at the end of the genealogy of morality. He refers to the people who oppose Christian morality today as pale atheists, antichrists, immoralists, nihilists, skeptics, aesthetics, and hectics of the mind. He says these last idealists of knowledge, in whom alone intellectual conscience dwells and is embodied these days, they believe they are all as liberated as possible from slave morality and its ascetic ideal. But Nietzsche says, these free, very free spirits, I will tell them what they themselves cannot see. The ascetic ideal of Christian morality is quite simply their ideal. They themselves represent it nowadays, and perhaps no one else. They themselves are its most intellectualized product. So why are today's atheists and skeptics, today's opposers of Christian morality, still themselves subscribing to the highest ideal of Christian morality? Well, again, Nietzsche says it's because they still believe in truth. And Nietzsche continues by saying, do not come to me with science when I'm looking for the natural antagonistic to slave morality's ascetic ideal. He says science and the ascetic ideal are still on the same foundation. What Nietzsche thinks is the real opponent of slave morality, he says later on 431, is art. He says art is much more fundamentally opposed to the ascetic ideal than science is. So there's two things that I want you to think about in your papers for this week. First, to what extent are you convinced by Nietzsche's claim that God is dead? Do you think most people are atheists today? Even if not, do you think that people are either theists or still believe in one unconditional value? Perhaps they believe in science's value of truth. The second question is, what does art signify for Nietzsche in the genealogy of morals? How does art provide an alternative to the belief in a single unconditional value? Right, so we saw in The Birth of Tragedy that Nietzsche thought life could be justified as an aesthetic phenomenon, an art phenomenon. And there, he meant that life could be justified insofar as it correctly combined Apollonian and Dionysian elements. It seems that in the genealogy of morals, Nietzsche has a different claim in mind. So what is it here that art provides that serves as a model for a good moral system? Specifically, how is it in art that there is not a single highest value, in the way that in science, truth is the single highest value? What is it about art that we can model our lives on in a way to finally oppose Christian morality? And how is it that whatever was bad about Christian morality doesn't plague art as well?